developments and also on the alpha, which they're going to tell you more about.
Cool. Devin, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Paul Collis, and I'll be presenting with my colleague, Ben, on Molecule. Actually wait, I'm just quickly going to share my screen. Yeah, having Jeff present beforehand was actually perfect in terms of what we're trying to do. In some ways, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yep. Yes.
Okay.
We
Awesome. In some ways, like what we're building with Molecule is kind of a commons for basic research and science around drug discovery. So our team has been influenced a lot by the common stack thinking, which has been really, really cool for us. So a big shout out there. Cool. First, kind of a basic overview. What are we trying to build with Molecule, and like what's the fundamental problem in pharma and drug development today? If you look at this little, and I'll keep this very short, if you look at this little diagram on the right, that is basically the funnel that we have today that brings new medicine and therapeutics and drugs to markets. Over the past 30 to 40 years, it's become exponentially more expensive to develop drugs and bring them to market. It costs on average $2.5 billion to take a new medicine or new drug through this entire life cycle until you get FDA approval. It takes 10 to 12 years in the current system. And increasingly, we're ending up with very, very high prices for new therapeutics as kind of big pharma is discovering less and less compounds. So what our mission is at Molecule really is to move pharma and biotech from these siloed pipelines to an open R&D marketplace and ecosystem. I'm saying this is a siloed pipeline at the moment. Pharma and biotech are really one of the last industries that take this entire development process and do it themselves. So pharma is very closed source today. Everything happens under NDA. As kind of compounds move from one stage to the next, there's a huge markup, obviously, as new investors come in and the drug moves from one player to another. But the entire data creation process here is closed source, and every company operates by themselves to a certain extent. So what we're trying to build with Molecule is really take this, how the current development works, and bring this into like an open marketplace. And an open marketplace means that on the one side, you have IP and the data around that IP moving into a marketplace. And on the other side, you have patients, universities, investors, pharmaceutical companies that can collaborate on the development of that IP. And this is where we think, or like, sorry, I think someone's not on mute. Okay. I've been following the curation market space ever kind of since Simon started writing about it early on, and thought this was one of the coolest applications that I could think of. It's like, what if we use curation markets to really further the development of medicine in a new open way that would benefit society? So maybe just kind of a brief history of how we kind of came about building this, or like what some of our first thinking was, which was inspired by Billy Rennekamp, who's on this call. Fundamentally, IP is always based on patents and proprietary data. We can take that data in the IP and attach it to a non-fungible token, so an ERC 721. So instead of CryptoKitties, we now attach molecular data or any new invention in general. And then we attach that NFT to a bonding curve by setting the ERC20 bonding curve token as the owner address of the ERC 721. And boom, now we kind of have tradable IP in an open network. And the role that I won't go too deep into what bonding curves do, but this concept of refungible tokens, so making a non-fungible fungible again, was first spearheaded by Billy. I'm really looking forward. I think we're slowly seeing more and more experiments where people are saying, "Cool, let's make an NFT fungible again." So that's always been a fundamental part of our stack. How does this relate to sorry, one back. How does this relate to basic research and science? We can now use bonding curves as prediction markets. One of the problems in this industry here is that currently market participants, if they own the entire piece of the pie, so to speak, they don't have any incentive to release negative research data. And what bonding curves in this sense do is, because different participants can trade up and down the curve, we now have incentives to release positive research data, which is likely to increase the price. And as well, we release negative research data, which is likely to decrease the price. So market participants have incentives to reveal data in the same way that prediction markets do this. They have an incentive to analyze the data and place their bets accordingly. We think this kind of thinking and applying this to the sciences can have a much bigger long-term impact, specifically because it can address some of the current challenges that we have in science around reproducibility of data. Yeah, the cool thing for us is if we also attach real assets to these markets now, so they're not just prediction markets, you're actually trading shares of IP. What are the implications here for things like insider trading? If I'm now trading on scientific data that anyone can freely produce. So this is kind of just as a brief overview and kind of where the journey, kind of our journey has taken us. So I'm really excited. We've previously announced this at the Token Engineering Global Summit as well, but I'm really excited to tell you more about the alpha that we're launching in early October this year. So our alpha is called Molecule Catalyst, and our goal for this alpha is to crowdfund 3 and potentially more projects in the area of basic research. So if you think back to that diagram I showed you earlier, what we're now focusing on is that first kind of funnel that generates new potential insights on new potential treatments. And Catalyst, in a sense, is an experiment in bonding curves and incentive design around how we can fund basic research. The target areas that we're going to go for in this launch are in rare and neglected diseases, in biogerontology and aging research, and in psychedelic studies. The reason why we've chosen those areas are, one, because we feel they have a good appeal for the crypto community, but also because those are actually areas where it's very hard to get funding in basic research for, because they're not as commercially interesting, or they're still fringy topics that larger pharmaceutical companies don't have as much interest in. Briefly about the properties, but I'll dive into the architecture of the alpha. So these are all public bonded markets on mainnet Ethereum. All markets will be funded via DAI, which also makes them somewhat interoperable with the broader DeFi ecosystem. And each project has a funding goal between $20,000 to $100,000. So we also chose this kind of chose to start off with this area because the funding we can make a big impact on a small set of research that can then also funnel on and actually start growing through this drug development cycle. Cool. So I want to give you some info, a little bit about the projects to actually make this much more concrete. So one, I can't reveal the institutions yet that we're working with, but there were 3 leading drug development labs at leading universities, 2 in the US, 1 in the US, 1 in Canada, and 1 in Denmark. The first project is a high-impact clinical trial to study the effects of microdosing psilocybin. And it's a double-blind study with real people. So it's a real clinical trial that is testing this. The second one is, we can reveal this because it's already been signed. It's with the University of Copenhagen and their biogerontology lab, which is on discovering interventions linked to healthy aging and longer lifespan. So they're basically testing a range of molecules and the effect that has on human cell metabolism and lifespan, which could ultimately lead to in both cases, to really promising new drugs being developed. So how does this tie together with Catalyst? So these are 2 examples of research projects that will be launching on the system. We're really excited. I'm personally really excited about this. It's kind of bringing a real life asset and a real life use case into the Ethereum space, and kind of leveraging the power that we can build with these markets. So kind of want to give you a basic overview of what the architecture for the alpha looks like. And then Ben is going to go a lot deeper into what it looks like and the different incentive schemes that we're building behind it. So this is a kind of a high-level diagram. So on the one side, you have funders that stake DAI into individual campaigns to contribute to the campaigns. In a very similar way that the common stack has both a collateral pool and a funding pool, our system works in the same way. So there's a funding tax that gets taken out of each contribution that goes to the researcher. Once a funding campaign is filled up, either it's an individual project milestone that has been met. So let's say, for example, $25,000 to be able to perform the first state of the study. Those project results are then released on a continuous basis. And in return, the funders receive a stake in the project. Now, a little bit about the legal parts around this. So the participants are essentially gambling on the success of a donation campaign. So all of these contributions into a market and to a project are considered donations. So it's like a collective grant that is coming together to fund a specific researcher. Every funder and contributor stands to win back a part of their contribution and potentially also make a return on their contribution, depending at what stage they entered the bonding curve. So obviously, early backers actually stand to make a return if the campaign goes successful or even overshoots its goal. This obviously also depends on their own efforts. So the funders now have an incentive to promote this research project to other people in order to get more contribution in. The tokens itself represent the value of the curve collateral. So the tokens that I get now for contributing to the project are my stake in the overall collateral pool. Then depending on the project, they're also just a memento of the project. So the researcher can later on decide, hey guys, thank you so much for supporting me. I'm going to give you X or Y. It may also represent governance rights in the project data that is coming out. Ideally, all of the project data is being open source though. And for us, the most exciting part of this is that the tokens may also represent a future rights to the IP that is coming out of it. Now, the problem is with IP coming out of these projects, if I go back, we're in this basic research space, and there is no IP yet that is created about these projects. However, and there is no claim that these tokens give me on the IP. However, if very promising IP comes out of a research project like this, and here with the University of Copenhagen, we're really looking at specific models that could result from this, then the lab could decide to allocate a portion of the IP to the token holders. However, this would be almost on a voluntary basis. And so that's some of the challenges that we've been dealing with as well, is like, how do you find a mix between voluntary donations, but also being able to stand to own a part of what could potentially come out of this without having any rights to it. Yeah. And maybe on this note as well, so this is essentially using the same model as Kickstarter is using, but with a slight twist on it. So from a legal perspective, and the advantage of that is for us is like all of these markets can be fully open. There is no KYC that participants need to go through, and that was one big goal for us, to really be able to push something out into the ecosystem that was open, that people could interact with very directly. Cool. I want to hand it over to Ben at this point.
Cool. Thanks, Paul. Let me just get my screen up for all of you. Okay, can you see the slides?
Yep, we got you.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to take you through some of the demo screens from the Molecule Catalyst web app, and then briefly go over some of the CAD simulations that we've done ourselves. So I'm glad Jeff took us over a background of CAD and what you can achieve with it. So the first step for the project creator or the researcher is to design their campaign, set up specific phases where they would like to get a predefined amount of funding over a time period, much like you would do with Kickstarter. So you have the options of either making the duration the sort of hard limit, where once you reach the end of that duration, the funding is redistributed fairly, and once you reach the funding goal, the project who's created this campaign will then be able to use those funds to fund further research. Once the project is created, then there's a basic sort of discover page where a user will be able to go and investigate the projects on the system and see what research has been produced, what funding they're looking for, how they can contribute, and get a better idea of how successful a project is currently. So here's an example where we've got a drug that is being developed for health and lifespan extension. So you would have a basic overview and abstract. You would be able to see the phases that were described earlier and the goals to complete those phases. You'd also then be able to see for a particular project what the funding status is, and you could enter in for example, here, 3 phases with different funding goals over different periods. The bonding curve market is a basic linear bonding curve with a few twists, which we'll show you later in the CAD simulations. But basically, the incentive pool that you're entering into will grow or decrease in value over time, depending on how popular or successful the campaign is. And you will be able to get a return on the portion of the contribution going into the incentive pool. So much like with the augmented bonding curve, you would have 2 separate pools, one for the funding of the project and the other for basic trading behavior and governance rights over maybe potential production of IP. Okay, and yeah, the idea is that the research results will be open source. There might be variations of this in future, but for our first version, the research results are published so that the public can see them, and potential rights over this data could be attached to token ownership, for example. So we also looked at incentive design and wanted to look at the 2 extremes of funder archetypes. So, for example, you have got a funder whose primary goal is to receive a return on investment on their contribution, less the contribution tax, and they would be betting on the success of the project campaign and its tokens. The tokens representing not only something that could be burned for collateral DAI, but also for future potential IP. And depending what archetype of investor you are, you might decide to choose one over the other, or where your primary goal is altruistic support with certain other benefits that could be attached, so over a pure donation. So it's a big challenge balancing these incentives. You can't get anything for free. Like Jeff said, it's not a money-making machine. But the aim is to implement as balanced a system as possible where both fund archetypes are incentivized to participate. And traditionally in a donation campaign, you lack any other incentive other than being a decent human being. Okay, so looking at CAD, which Jeff took you over earlier, we've got a few system parameters that we've been testing, which are primarily bonding curve parameter design, how the system behaves under pump and dump behavior, how do you avoid those issues, and returns and participation incentives for the users, as shown earlier, and effects of different curve taxation. So maybe continuous curve taxation over a time period, varying curve taxation to swing the favor from early investors back to later investors, things like that. So one thing we noticed, which Jeff touched on briefly, was with CAD, the idea of implementing rigorous mathematical simulations. It's not always possible. We don't all have that experience, or we don't necessarily know the parameters of the system entirely. Maybe it's too complex to model or model accurately. So instead, you can look at best and worst case scenarios. You can treat it as a black box system and see how the system varies in accordance to changes in parameter or sensitivity to a parameter. So we've looked at, for example, a distribution heat map of return on investment or value for a user. So depending on where a user buys in versus where they sell out, you can see that for a basic linear curve, starting at the origin, you have some users receiving 1,200% return on investment, others receiving nothing or negative, which is this purple color here. If you shift the linear bonding curve up the y-axis, which is essentially just a hard-coded hatch price, like Jeff mentioned for the augmented bonding curve, we've chosen a hard-coded hatch price of approximately 0.5 DAI per token, which results in a much fairer distribution where users are receiving between 0 or negative to 12% return. And we find that approximately 30% of users will make a return on investment for this simplistic system simulation. And if you then further distribute the collateral on a flat 100% collateralized curve, you then get an even better distribution where more people are, it's difficult to see in this diagram, but the numbers show that more people will receive a return on investment. Okay, and also, once again, rather than doing like too deep mathematical design, we took two basic funder behaviors, which is buy and hold or seek a percentage return on investment, and modeled those. I won't go too much into that. Yeah, and there's a lot of parallels with the augmented bonding curve, but the augmented bonding curve goes well and beyond what we're doing at the moment, and maybe we'll even fork it in future. So yeah, thank you for listening to our presentation. If you've got any questions or want to join our social groups, here are all the details.
Yeah, guys, I just want to say as well, if anyone's keen to get involved, we're doing user testing at the moment, so we'd love your feedback. Easiest way is to just join our Telegram group or ping us on, ping us on Telegram. We're also opening up a Discord. Just ask for the invite for that on Telegram. It's still kind of closed. And we'd love for any of you to become early backers, obviously, for these projects when they go live. So get your DAI ready. And yeah, happy to take any questions still.
We are running a little bit behind on time, so we can take maybe one question. If anyone has anything, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask out.
I can also answer questions in the chat if that speeds things up.
Sure.
Yeah.
We can do that. And then if you guys do have any questions as well, if you think of anything afterwards, please just drop them into the chat and we can get to them at the end of the presentation. So we have our final presenter coming up now, and really looking